What happens when the person who believes they control the interview suddenly realizes the cameras are capturing everything, and the guest sitting across from them is no longer playing defense? That is exactly what made this Johnny Depp and Joy Behar confrontation so explosive. What began as a seemingly routine television interview quickly turned into a battle for control, and before the conversation was over, Behar was reportedly desperate to end the moment before it went any further. The shocking part wasn't simply that Depp pushed back. It was how calmly he did it. While Behar became increasingly frustrated, Depp appeared almost completely unfazed, answering her challenges with measured responses that slowly turned the spotlight back onto her. And then came the moment nobody expected. Behar realized the conversation was no longer going in the direction she wanted. The questions she had intended to use against Depp were suddenly exposing something much bigger: the strategy behind the interview itself. The atmosphere changed. The confidence disappeared. And eventually the demand came: cut the cameras. But why? What happened in those final moments that made Behar desperate to stop the recording? And how did Johnny Depp go from being the person under pressure to becoming the one controlling the entire conversation? Because the answer begins long before those cameras were ever ordered to stop. Before we get into how that moment unfolded, make sure you subscribe, because this is the kind of confrontation where one small exchange changes everything. And if you were watching this unfold in real time, ask yourself one question. At what exact moment did Joy Behar realize she had lost control? Because that is what makes this encounter so fascinating. At the beginning, there was no obvious sign that anything was about to go wrong. Johnny Depp had walked into the interview expecting to discuss his career, his creative work, and what came next. The atmosphere appeared routine, the kind of television appearance designed to promote a project and give viewers a closer look at the person behind it. But Behar had something else in mind. She wasn't simply preparing questions. She was preparing a confrontation. And the crucial detail was that Depp didn't know exactly where she intended to take the conversation. That gave Behar what she believed was an advantage. She could introduce the controversial subjects, apply pressure, and watch for the reaction she wanted. There was only one problem. Depp didn't react the way she expected. And once that happened, every question Behar asked began creating a completely different kind of tension, one that would eventually force her to make the decision that changed the entire interview. From the moment Johnny Depp took his seat, Joy Behar appeared completely comfortable in the position of control. This was her environment, her audience, her questions, and, at least in her mind, her rules. She understood how daytime television worked. She knew how to build tension, when to interrupt, and how to push a guest until a carefully controlled conversation became something far more dramatic. Depp, meanwhile, appeared relaxed. He greeted the audience, settled into the conversation, and seemed prepared to discuss his professional life. Nothing about his demeanor suggested that he expected an ambush. That may have been exactly what Behar wanted. She had reportedly prepared a series of questions designed to put him under pressure. Instead of allowing the conversation to remain focused on his work, she intended to move quickly toward the controversies surrounding him and challenge him directly. In her mind, the strategy was simple. Ask the uncomfortable question. Push when he hesitates. Interrupt if necessary. Keep the pressure high. What she didn't anticipate was that Depp would refuse to play the role of a cornered celebrity. And the moment she launched her first serious attack, the entire balance of the interview began to change. Because Behar thought she was setting a trap, she didn't realize she was stepping into one herself. Behar wasted almost no time before abandoning the comfortable opening she had planned for Depp's career. Instead, she leaned forward and delivered the kind of question designed to immediately put a guest on the defensive. Her message was unmistakable. After everything that had happened, why should anyone still care about Johnny Depp? The atmosphere changed instantly. What had been a welcoming interview suddenly felt like an interrogation. The audience grew quieter, waiting for Depp to react. Everyone understood what Behar was attempting to do. She wanted him uncomfortable. She wanted hesitation. Most importantly, she wanted an emotional response. But Depp simply paused. Then he looked toward her with an expression that suggested he was more surprised by the approach than threatened by it. He questioned why the conversation had suddenly shifted from his work to a personal attack. His tone remained controlled, almost conversational, and that calmness created an unexpected problem for Behar. She had prepared for resistance. She hadn't prepared for composure. So she pushed harder, insisting that difficult questions were necessary and that public figures couldn't expect their controversies to disappear simply because they were sitting on a television set promoting a new project. Depp listened, and then he delivered the response that changed the direction of the entire interview. Instead of defending himself, he questioned Behar's intentions. That single move forced everyone watching to consider a completely different question. Was this really an interview, or had Behar entered the conversation determined to create a confrontation? And once that question was on the table, she couldn't easily make it disappear. The first real power shift happened when Depp stopped treating Behar's questions as attacks he needed to survive and started examining the way those questions were being asked. It was a subtle change, but everyone in the room could feel it. Behar was still speaking with confidence, yet Depp was no longer reacting like the guest. He was responding like someone evaluating the interviewer. Behar argued that she was simply asking the questions viewers wanted answered. She insisted that a public figure couldn't expect difficult subjects to remain untouched. Her confidence returned as she framed herself as the person demanding accountability. Depp didn't challenge the right to ask difficult questions. He challenged the motive behind them. He pointed out that there was a difference between being direct and deliberately provoking someone. A difficult question could still be respectful. A controversial subject could still be discussed intelligently. But when the purpose became embarrassing the guest rather than understanding the issue, the conversation changed completely. That distinction visibly unsettled Behar. She had expected Depp to defend himself. Instead, he was calmly analyzing her approach. And then came the rehook that made the situation even more dangerous. The harder Behar tried to prove that she was simply doing her job, the more Depp's argument seemed to gain strength. For the first time, Behar wasn't controlling the conversation. She was explaining herself. And that was only the beginning. Rather than stepping back, Behar pushed forward. She had already realized that Depp wasn't becoming defensive, but instead of changing her approach, she increased the pressure. Her questions became sharper, her tone more challenging, and the conversation moved further away from the professional discussion Depp had expected. She reminded him that his public image had changed dramatically and suggested that he couldn't simply return to television without answering for the controversies surrounding him. To Behar, this was still an opportunity to force an admission. But Depp remained remarkably composed. He listened until she finished, then responded without matching her intensity. He acknowledged that his life had been discussed publicly for years, but questioned why Behar seemed less interested in understanding his perspective than in proving a predetermined conclusion. That answer frustrated her. She interrupted, insisting that he was avoiding accountability. Depp didn't raise his voice. Instead, he calmly asked what accountability meant if the interviewer had already decided what the answer should be before asking the question. For a brief moment, Behar appeared caught between two choices: continue attacking and risk making Depp's argument stronger, or change direction and surrender the confrontation she had worked so hard to create. She chose neither. She doubled down. And that decision created the next turning point, because Depp began addressing something Behar had not expected him to notice: the strategy behind her questions. The interview was no longer simply getting tense. It was becoming a battle over who understood the situation better. And Behar was beginning to realize that Depp was watching her just as carefully as she was watching him. Depp's next move was the one Behar seemed least prepared for. Instead of answering another accusation on its own terms, he stepped back and questioned what was really driving the conversation. He suggested that the intensity wasn't coming from genuine curiosity about his work, or even from a desire to understand the controversies surrounding him. It appeared to him that Behar had entered the interview with a conclusion already formed. The statement changed the atmosphere immediately. Behar denied it. She insisted that she was doing exactly what an interviewer was supposed to do: ask uncomfortable questions and refuse to let a famous guest avoid difficult subjects. But Depp calmly pointed out that asking a difficult question and attempting to provoke a particular reaction were two very different things. Then he went further. He suggested that the interview seemed designed to create a moment rather than create understanding. If Depp became angry, Behar could portray him as defensive. If he walked away, she could portray him as unable to face criticism. And if he became emotional, the confrontation itself would become the story. For the first time, Behar's confidence appeared to weaken, because Depp wasn't simply answering her anymore. He was explaining her strategy to the audience. And that created a dangerous problem. Every attempt she made to deny his accusation gave him another opportunity to explain why he believed it was true. The trap was changing. Behar had wanted Depp to react under pressure. Instead, Depp was making the pressure visible. And once the audience began noticing that, the interview entered an entirely different phase. By this point, the tension had become impossible to ignore. The other co-hosts could see what was happening even if Behar refused to acknowledge it. They exchanged uneasy looks and attempted to steer the discussion back toward Depp's professional work, hoping that a change of subject might calm the atmosphere before the confrontation went any further. One co-host brought up Depp's career and asked about the projects that had brought him back into the spotlight. It was an obvious opening. Depp appeared ready to take it, but Behar interrupted. She insisted that the difficult questions needed to be answered first, arguing that changing the subject would allow Depp to avoid accountability. Her determination was unmistakable, but the reaction around her suggested something had changed. The other hosts were no longer following her lead. They were watching her. The audience was watching her too, and Depp seemed to recognize the shift immediately. He calmly explained that he wasn't afraid of difficult questions. What concerned him was the apparent intention behind them. If the goal was an honest conversation, he was willing to have one. But if the goal was to provoke humiliation, then the discussion had already crossed a line. Behar pushed back again. Yet every interruption made the situation more uncomfortable. The strange part was that Depp wasn't raising his voice. He wasn't threatening to leave. He wasn't losing his temper. He simply kept answering, and that made the contrast impossible to miss. The person who had entered the interview expecting to control the conversation was now fighting to keep everyone from changing it. At that moment, the question wasn't whether Depp could survive the confrontation. It was whether Behar could survive the consequences of continuing it. Behar finally reached the point where restraint disappeared from her voice. She accused Depp of trying to turn the situation around on her, arguing that he couldn't walk into a television studio, face uncomfortable questions, and then criticize the person asking them. In her mind, the confrontation was still about accountability. Depp saw it differently. He leaned forward and calmly explained that he had no problem answering difficult questions. What he objected to was being treated as though the verdict had already been decided. If Behar wanted an honest discussion, he said, then she should be willing to hear an answer she didn't expect. That statement hit harder than another accusation could have. Behar demanded to know whether he believed he was above criticism. Depp replied that nobody was above criticism. Not him, not her, not anyone in the room. But criticism required substance. Calling someone a bad person, repeatedly attacking their character, and then refusing to discuss specifics wasn't the same as asking a difficult question. The room became almost completely silent. Behar attempted to interrupt, but Depp continued, still measured and controlled. He suggested that she wasn't really asking him to explain himself anymore. She was asking him to accept her version of events. That was the moment the confrontation changed again. Because Behar had spent the interview trying to make Depp defend his reputation. Now Depp was asking Behar to defend her method. And suddenly, the person holding the microphone was the one being questioned. The power had shifted. But Behar wasn't ready to surrender it. She made one more aggressive move. And that decision would push the interview toward its breaking point. The breaking point came when Depp stopped responding to the confrontation as a guest and began addressing the audience directly. His voice remained calm, but his words carried a seriousness that immediately changed the atmosphere. He explained that he had arrived expecting an intelligent conversation about his career, his work, and the lessons he had learned throughout decades in the entertainment industry. Instead, he found himself being confronted with accusations that seemed designed to provoke rather than understand. Then he turned the argument back toward Behar. He asked why aggression had become the measure of good interviewing. Why did asking a guest uncomfortable questions require attacking their character? And why did creating a dramatic television moment seem more important than actually listening to the person sitting across the table? Behar attempted to interrupt, but Depp continued. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't insulting her. He was simply exposing the contradiction. The audience grew increasingly quiet as his argument developed. Even the other co-hosts seemed reluctant to interfere now. Then Depp delivered the observation that struck deepest. If Behar genuinely believed she was conducting a fair interview, she shouldn't be afraid of hearing an answer she disagreed with. That sentence created a silence that felt heavier than anything that had come before. Because suddenly, Behar's greatest problem wasn't Depp's answers. It was the possibility that the audience had started seeing the interview through his eyes. And once that happened, her authority began slipping away in real time. But instead of stepping back, Behar made one final attempt to reclaim control. And that was when everything moved toward the moment viewers would remember most. Behar could feel the conversation slipping away, and she responded the way experienced television personalities often do when they sense control disappearing. She tried to take command of the room again. She reminded Depp that this was her show and that she had every right to ask whatever questions she believed were necessary. Her tone became firmer, almost as if authority itself could restore the balance that had already shifted. But Depp didn't challenge her authority with anger. He simply questioned what that authority was being used for. He told her that having the power to ask a question didn't automatically make every approach reasonable. A host could control the microphone, the schedule, and the subject, but none of those things guaranteed control over the conversation itself. That response visibly frustrated Behar. She tried to interrupt, insisting that Depp was avoiding the real issue. But he calmly reminded her that he had answered repeatedly. The problem, he suggested, was that she didn't seem satisfied unless he gave the answer she wanted. The room became tense again. Then Behar made her most revealing move. She attempted to end the discussion by announcing that they should take a commercial break. For a moment, it looked as though she had finally found a way out. But Depp wasn't finished. He calmly told her that if they were going to have this conversation, they should finish it honestly rather than abruptly cutting away the moment it became uncomfortable. The statement landed like a challenge. Behar had tried to reclaim control by ending the segment. Instead, her attempt made everyone wonder why she suddenly wanted the conversation to stop. And that question would lead directly to the moment the cameras became her biggest problem. The atmosphere reached its breaking point when Behar realized that the conversation had moved completely beyond the boundaries she had originally intended. She had tried to redirect it, tried to interrupt it, and finally tried to end it with a commercial break. But none of those moves restored the control she once seemed to have. Depp remained seated, calm, focused, and completely unwilling to let the confrontation be rewritten as something it wasn't. Behar's frustration became increasingly visible. She argued that the interview had gone too far and that there was no reason to continue. But Depp calmly reminded her that the tension hadn't appeared out of nowhere. It had been created by the way the interview began. Then came the moment that changed everything. Behar looked toward the production area and demanded that the cameras be cut. For a brief second, the entire room seemed frozen. The request was startling because the cameras were exactly what had given the confrontation its power. As long as they continued recording, every response, every interruption, every uncomfortable silence remained part of the record. And now Behar wanted that record to stop. Depp didn't react with triumph. Instead, he remained composed and allowed the weight of the moment to speak for itself. The audience understood what had happened. The host who had started the interview believing she could control every question was now asking for the one thing that could prevent the audience from seeing what happened next. The cameras. But by then, the confrontation had already reached a point where stopping the recording couldn't erase what had happened. And the most dramatic power shift was still waiting to happen. The power reversal was complete. At the beginning of the interview, Behar had controlled the questions, the pace, and the direction of the conversation. Depp had entered as the guest, the person expected to answer whatever was placed in front of him. But now those roles had almost completely reversed. Behar was the one trying to explain herself. Depp was the one setting the pace. And the more she attempted to regain control, the more obvious the shift became. He reminded her that he hadn't come there looking for a confrontation. He had accepted the invitation because he believed there was going to be a genuine conversation. If Behar wanted to challenge him, he was prepared to answer. But if the objective was to embarrass him, then she had underestimated the person sitting across from her. That statement silenced the room. Behar had expected resistance. What she hadn't expected was composure. Depp never needed to overpower her voice. He simply refused to surrender his own. Then he delivered the line that summarized the entire confrontation. Sometimes the person asking the questions believes they're in control simply because they hold the microphone. But the moment the guest stops accepting the rules of the interrogation, that control can disappear. The audience sat quietly. Behar looked toward the production area again. The cameras were still rolling. And suddenly, the very thing she had wanted to use to create a memorable television moment had become the evidence she desperately wanted gone. That was the real reversal. Depp hadn't taken control by shouting. He had taken control by staying calm. And Behar's demand to stop the cameras only made that victory more unmistakable. The moment Behar demanded that the cameras stop, the atmosphere inside the studio changed completely. What had begun as a confrontational interview had become a situation nobody seemed certain how to control. Producers were suddenly faced with the uncomfortable reality that the exchange had gone far beyond the polished conversation they had expected to broadcast. Depp remained remarkably composed. He didn't celebrate. He didn't taunt Behar. He simply sat there, watching the confusion unfold around him, while the people behind the production area tried to determine what should happen next. The other co-hosts appeared equally uncertain. Nobody wanted to make the situation worse, but nobody seemed willing to pretend that nothing had happened either. Behar's frustration was still obvious. She had attempted to end the conversation, but the damage to the interview's original structure had already been done. The confrontation had exposed a completely different dynamic from the one viewers expected when Depp first walked onto the set. For several tense moments, the studio seemed caught between continuing the interview and ending it immediately. And that uncertainty was revealing, because Depp had entered as the person who supposedly needed to explain himself. Now everyone was waiting to see what he would say next. The irony was difficult to miss. Behar had wanted a dramatic television moment. She had gotten one. But it wasn't the moment she had planned. And as the tension began spreading beyond the studio itself, another problem was waiting for her. What would happen once viewers started talking about what they had just witnessed? That was when the confrontation stopped being a television problem and became a much bigger story. What happened after the confrontation was almost as significant as what happened inside the studio. The moment viewers began discussing the exchange, the story took on a life of its own. People weren't simply debating Johnny Depp's answers anymore. They were dissecting Joy Behar's reaction, her attempts to regain control, and most importantly, the moment she wanted the cameras stopped. That became the question everyone kept returning to. Why? Why would a host who had spent the entire interview demanding answers suddenly want the recording to end when the conversation turned back toward her? The contrast was impossible to ignore. Depp had remained composed while the pressure increased. Behar, meanwhile, appeared increasingly frustrated as her strategy stopped producing the reaction she wanted. That reversal gave viewers something far more compelling than a simple celebrity interview. It gave them a power struggle. And power struggles are exactly what audiences remember. The discussion spread rapidly, with viewers taking sides and replaying the most intense exchanges in their minds. Some argued that Behar had simply asked questions others were afraid to ask. Others believed Depp had exposed the difference between challenging a guest and attempting to provoke one. But beneath the arguments was one undeniable point. The interview had completely escaped its original purpose. Behar wanted a memorable confrontation. Instead, the confrontation became memorable for a reason she never intended. And the phrase that defined the entire aftermath was remarkably simple. Cut the cameras. Because once that request became the focus, viewers weren't just asking what Depp had said. They were asking what Behar was afraid the cameras would capture next. What made this confrontation resonate wasn't simply the presence of two recognizable television personalities. It was the psychological shift that happened right in front of the audience. At the beginning, Behar appeared to have every advantage. She had prepared the questions, controlled the setting, and expected Depp to respond on her terms. But Depp did something that disrupted the entire strategy. He stayed calm. Instead of allowing anger to dictate his responses, he questioned the assumptions behind the questions themselves. Every time Behar increased the pressure, he became more deliberate. Every time she tried to frame him as defensive, he redirected attention toward the structure of the conversation. And eventually, the audience had a completely different question to consider. Who was actually being tested? That is why the moment carried such weight. A confrontation becomes powerful when the expected roles suddenly reverse. The guest is supposed to defend himself. The host is supposed to remain in control. But when those roles become blurred, viewers become emotionally invested because they can feel the uncertainty. And there was another reason this moment resonated. The camera request became symbolic. Behar had entered believing that the cameras would capture her control of the situation. By the end, those same cameras represented something completely different, an uncomfortable record of a conversation that had escaped her control. That is the lesson at the center of the entire confrontation. You can control the microphone. You can control the questions. But you cannot always control where the answers take the conversation. And sometimes, the moment you realize that is the moment everyone else realizes it too. In the end, the most unforgettable part of the confrontation wasn't the first question, the sharpest accusation, or even the moment Depp turned the conversation around. It was the moment Behar realized that the interview had become something she could no longer control. She had started with the confidence of someone who believed she held all the cards. But Depp refused to react according to the script she seemed to expect. He stayed composed. He questioned the motive behind the confrontation. And eventually, the person who had been asking all the questions found herself defending her own approach. Then came those words, "Cut the cameras." And that single demand changed the meaning of everything that had happened before it. Because once a host asks for the cameras to stop, viewers naturally begin wondering what happened in those final moments that made continuing the conversation feel so dangerous. That is why this confrontation continues to capture attention. It wasn't simply about Johnny Depp or Joy Behar. It was about what happens when confidence turns into pressure, when pressure turns into confrontation, and when the person who believes they're controlling the moment suddenly realizes the moment is controlling them. So now I want to hear from you. Do you think Depp successfully turned the entire interview around? Or did Behar simply push harder than necessary? Drop your opinion in the comments. And if you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications for more dramatic celebrity confrontations and unforgettable television moments. Because sometimes the most powerful moment isn't when someone wins the argument. It's when the person who started the argument realizes they can no longer control how it ends.